most when I think about it.
Have coffee and breakfast and schmooze. So anyways, this is the last topics of the millennium. And we'll see. Yeah, I'll let you know in the spring. I'm going to probably set something up in the spring. I'm just not sure why. I don't know if I'm going to do it this way anymore, because as it's getting, fewer and fewer people are coming, I'm having harder time just getting, audience. So I'll probably do something, but probably not, as frequently. Again, I want to thank David, Freya, and Eli for the use of their space. And the topic today is rational parenting, which I've talked about before and certainly has come up here. But more specifically, my particular interest is less the theoretical and more the practical issue of what happens to a perfectly good concept like rational parenting or self-regulation when it's translated through the armored organism or the armored social system. And so that would explain the subtitle of the lecture, which is the failure of liberal parenting and education. But just as a start to set the agenda, it seems to me that one has to understand what self-regulation is, and that's always, in many respects, one of the hardest things to understand. Among people, most of you who have been in touch with Reich's work in one way or another for a number of years, among people who have an active interest in Reich's work, or the work of A.S. Neill and other collaborators, self-regulation is usually, a banner that we all, flock to, or at least the few of us that flock, come. And certainly the concepts of self-regulation have become socially much more present. One can read, extensive literature, popular literature that encourages breastfeeding on demand, a more active sense of not forcing your child to use the toilet. I mean, there are these concepts that have become much more ubiquitous or present in the social arena, but ostensibly there are profound problems with the way people understand these. And I think not the least of which are the way people who feel very sympathetic or very pro-self-regulation or pro-self-regulatory approaches towards parenting come to it. And I think there, more than anything, there are profound misunderstandings about what Reich meant about self-regulation, and I think what certainly Neill meant. There are two concepts really that have to be looked at together when we talk about self-regulation, and the second often in discussions of this whole process gets short shrift, and that Neill made a very significant contribution in saying that you can't only have self-regulation of the individual, you have to have the individual functioning in a society that has self-governance, that has social manifestations that support the individual's act of self-regulatory process. So the issue of what I want to first attempt to give a working definition of self-regulation and its social, mass psychological perspective, which is self-governance. Okay? The first thing to understand about maybe the best way to approach it, it seems to me, is to first state what self-regulation isn't. Okay? Self-regulation isn't, as A.S. Neill said, it isn't license. Self-regulation is not, doing your own thing or expressing yourself, and anything that you express is, since it's from you, it must be right and has to be respected. Self-regulation isn't a concept of everybody is right in their own way kind of attitude, which became obviously very, very big in the 60s and 70s, particularly with the new generation of liberals. So with that in mind, the first thing to understand, it seems to me, is that self-regulation isn't something that one can simply define and say, this is what, it is, here it is, and there it is in operation. Self-regulation is a state in which the biological and physiological and emotional and behavioral organization of the individual finds a self-maintaining engagement in the environment. In other words, the key, really, in Reich's terms, is that you have this fundamental pulsation of the organism. We come back to that always, right? There's this energetic function. Self-regulation in Reich's terms is fundamentally an energetic, has an energetic core. That to understand self-regulation, the core of self-regulation is pulsation, or the orgasm function. And by that we don't mean having sex, and sex is obviously one of the primary expressions of orgastic potency or orgastic experience. But in our terms, when we say orgastic potency, we mean the ability of the organism to pulsate efficiently, fully, or as fully as possible, and to not be profoundly restricted or prevented or blocked from its natural expansion and contraction and the release and movement of energy as that takes place. And that in the simplest terms, what Reich talks about is that if that kind of functioning is not profoundly impaired, the organism is self-regulated. And Reich, a lot of people get frustrated with Reich because they read, and they say, okay, where's he going to tell me now what happens when the organism self-regulates, when this pulsation is not interfered with, or is interfered with on a less profound way? What does it look like? What does it express? How do these individuals present themselves? What are the keys to look for? What should I be attempting to do in my life that will make me look like a self-regulated individual, will make me feel like a and this is the point. Reich says very clearly himself, he wasn't even sure what that would look like. The best hint we have of what it would look like is to look at babies. So to the extent that the newborn organism is in its purest form, and not sentimentally, but literally, an organism that doesn't know yet from, I'm not supposed to do this, I'm not supposed to do that, simply pulsates, right? Provided you look at that organism carefully, and that's been one of my primary interests over the years, studying newborns and infants, because in the first 3 months of life, probably in the first year, but certainly in the first 3 months of life, is the opportunity to see the organism, the human organism, functioning relatively unimpeded, right? And so you get some baseline readings. And that kind of process begins, by the nature of social organization, to be interfered with or intercepted or redirected or reorganized almost immediately. So, and we'll get to that a little bit further on when we look at ways in which self-regulation is blocked or interfered. But I think to get a working sense of this, you're talking about the organism's ability to experience the expansions and contractions of natural physical pulsation with a minimum of frustration. So in newborns, the most common form of armoring that you'll see at the beginning is the anchoring of armoring is in the frustration of the newborn. Okay? And newborns have two characteristics. One is they become frustrated fairly easily. So often parents don't or run up against the fact that a delay of 30 seconds, which doesn't seem like much to the mother, can be very, very frustrating for the newborn. However, the other characteristic, which is inherently important, is that those levels of frustrations do not become easily anchored. They're very fluid. 30-second delay, 30-second frustration. Immediate, gratification at the end of 30 seconds, relaxation, and it's not going back to, oh, I was frustrated and now I'm not going to forgive you. That takes a long time for that kind of patterning organization of frustration into resentment or to a more socially organized or emotionally organized, position, or the beginnings of what we would then call, in ergonomic terms, character position, character attitude. It takes a long time. So in the newborn, frustration is simply an effective means of communicating the fact that something that the organism needs at the moment, isn't being gratified. Gratification is usually registered by fairly quick, immediate relaxation and response to the moment also. So again, the key remains this process of self-regulation, that the self determines when it's frustrated and when it's relaxed and gratified. And so the first mistake is often with people who get interested in self-regulation is to assume, and particularly we see this in mothers, some fathers also, but predominantly in mothers, is to assume that if the baby is ever frustrated, or expressing discomfort, I must be interfering with its self-regulatory processes, and that's not the case at all. Provided it's not a chronic, abusive situation where every time the baby has an impulse, you thwart it. The expression of frustration or even anger is simply a form of communication. If one then, in a proper communicative model, says, okay, I understand you're feeling this way on some level, let me respond to it or try to address it or deal with it, the organism can inherently adjust. And so that's self-regulation in terms of the dynamic. The goal of self-regulation is not a better society, is not a happier life. And that's the other big mistake that's often made about self-regulation. Because we, as outsiders who have decided to, give self-regulation a special status, think that the goal, that if we can only have self-regulation, right, we'll have a better world. And the goal of self-regulation has no such political agenda. It simply is the organism, functioning as efficiently, as effectively, and and to remain in a state of relative ease and relaxation. Okay? So the function of self-regulation has no moral or social significance. That's another big important step to understand that the object of self-regulation, there is no object of self-regulation. It is not an and that was Dr. Sobey always used to love to point out. It's not an intellectual, decision, and that's profound because of the fact that it is really. If you had to find a synonymous link for the concept of self-regulation, you would say that it is really synonymous with the biological core of the organism. So that would be it would be as crazy to say that the human organisms or the animal organism agenda is it seeks self-regulation as a purpose in life is as foolish as saying that an amoeba seeks fluid to maintain its life. It simply is. Self-regulation is synonymous with biological function.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I just say, but without a context that supports that or protects it, you can't have it.
But we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, the problem is because this is why it's such a difficult concept for most people to work with, and even those that were around Reich. He himself talks about how difficult it is for individuals who aren't self-regulating or self-regulated to even begin to come up with a way of dealing with it. So I mean, the classic, anecdotal situation is, I mean, Dr. Sobey used this publicly, so I'm not, and both parties are deceased now, so it wouldn't count. But Dr. Sobey always used to love to talk about his wife, who was a very brilliant woman, Francine Sobey, and had a great deal of intellectual understanding. She was a great social researcher, and she had worked with Reich, and she had good, so she knew these concepts intellectually quite well. And he would always, and he told it in front of her, and she would laugh, because it was true, that when their daughter was born, and she was determined to self-regulate, to approach it as a self-regulatory process, and she kept saying that, but of course she wanted it to be self-regulatory in some sort of, since she was a researcher and she herself was very organized, she was convinced that you could, by studying the child, figure out a predictable pattern of self-regulation. And so you could then predict when the child was going to want to nurse or when the child was going to want to sleep, and that there was a pattern that you could discover. And Dr. Soap used to pull this little hair he had more in those days, trying to say, you can't do that. That's not about you can't have an organized concept of self-regulation. So the problem is how one comes at organizing. And it's like saying, can you organize? I mean, part of what goes on when we talk about hurricane watches or tornado watches, these are elements of nature. And human beings are very frustrated by the fact that you can't say, we can predict how this hurricane, when it's going to come up, how it's going to move. And the greatest frustration that humans have, right, is they're watching a hurricane and saying, well, it's going to hit Charleston, North Carolina, unless it moves a couple of miles, and then it's going to hit over here, or it's going to move inland, and we're not sure, but it's going to hit. And then it doesn't hit, and then they say, why? Well, it didn't hit. The reality is they don't know. But our assumption is we should be able to determine the course of natural phenomena. So when we look at something like self-regulation, we assume that since it's in the human organism, it must respond to that kind of control, that kind of process, okay? When in fact, it is really, if you want to understand it, I just realized I'm saying this, it is the same kind of natural phenomena, right, as hurricanes, tornadoes. And it is not without reason that Reich, in his research, moved from the study of things like self-regulation in human organisms and animal organisms to weather and to natural patterns in the atmosphere, and saw them as intimately and distinctly just different expressions of the same kinds of energetic and biological phenomena. So actually, in one sense, your question, Bob, really reflects the problem that human beings have with these kinds of natural, or that we might say armored organisms, since we can all rest assured that every one of us here is armored to some degree or other, and rightfully so. How armored organisms, how organisms that are already socially organized respond to natural phenomena, natural processes, is highly perplexing and highly problematic. And one could write the history of the world based on how various groups of humans have attempted to explain these unexplainable, in a sense, uncontrollable natural process. And not that you can't explain it, but in one sense, the great frustration I think that people have with Reich's work is that while he offers wonderful insights, I think, and wonderful understandings of how and what these phenomena are, he doesn't offer simple, ways of organizing it, directing it, controlling it. And what he does is he leaves you with the fact that, look, you're going to pretty much have to do the best you can and try to figure this out and try to come to some sort of workable solution. One of the things that this becomes reflected in is that when Reich writes about social implications of self-regulatory processes, when he looks at the issue of how societies would be organized if we had a maximum, response to maintaining self-regulatory processes, his response is, I don't know. That we won't know, right, until we do it, or until relatively healthy self-regulating organisms begin to organize in a relatively free association. He then speculates what this could look like, or what would, he's better, I think, and as Neill does also, A.S. Neill, are better when they talk about conditions that might enhance or help in the creation of more conducive environmental circumstances for individuals to experience their self-regulatory processes and communicate in a more self-regulating interaction. And there, Neill projects that you need some form of social projection of self-regulatory impulses, in the sense seeing the social group, the social organization, as also a self-regulating organism and setting up social interactions that allow for individuals to govern themselves. So the concept that develops at Summerhill is the concept of what they call self-governance, which still goes on. It's been going on for many, many years. It's under attack again. Interesting. Just when you think it's safe to, assume that Summerhill is an old issue, it comes up and is big enough to make it into the New York Times. I don't know if everybody has seen the articles or the announcements that Summerhill suddenly is, you have all these people, some of them say, didn't that end in the 1960s or something? They realize it's been going on for years, quietly and successfully, and all of a sudden now it's back in the news again because the liberal British government, under the conservatives, they didn't have much trouble. They had some trouble, but they functioned quite, well. And under the liberal British government, that's trying to prove that it's really, going to make education better for everybody. They're going after Summerhill, and they're going after Summerhill, basically on the issues that Neill was always afraid of: that it doesn't have good toilets, that it has co-ed bathrooms and showers. And that students aren't required to learn how to read and take exams. But in the heart of that, if one reads the articles, they're always fascinated with how Summerhill runs. And the thing about how Summerhill runs is that it runs with a town meeting. Every member of the community, this has been going on for almost 60 years now, has one vote, including the director, the head of the school or the community. And they vote on everything. They vote on, whether they're going to have coffee, or whether they're going to have tea, or whether, whether the younger kids have to do this, or and if the younger kid, and Neill always encouraged, if the younger kids get together and organize a vote for what they want, if the younger kids, Neill used to always encourage them to organize to say, we're only going to have chocolate for breakfast. And they put that vote in, and Neill hated it. Neill was a health food fanatic. But if the younger kids could do that, he would encourage them to get all the votes and outlaw any food but chocolate in all the meals. Then a week later he'd organize a rebellion from another group. He was very much he would encourage issues, but the point being that the group has run very effectively by essentially setting the conditions for their own governance. Now, of course, that is very charming. There are problems with that because that assumes that you have inherently healthy, centered, well-directed, effectively self-regulating organisms that can operate in their own best interest. In fact, it's often not always the case, or it doesn't always look as neat, and simple as it would be. However, Reich actually went further. Reich had some doubts about this whole issue of simply, I think Neill at heart had a more anarchist view of things, which is that he believed inherently in the rightness of children particularly, and the rightness of organisms that were given freedom. Reich was much more sanguine on this in feeling that most organisms given freedom couldn't exercise it rationally or effectively, and that the problem is, Reich always liked to quote, the problem is that most ideas about self-regulation and self-governance suffer in the same way that anarchists and nudists, so this is Reich, Reich would say, it says in mass psychology, that the anarchist believes that all you have to do is strip away the abuses of government and social controls and have a free, non-organized society, and the thousands upon thousands of years of abuses of social oppression will disappear and self-regulate, self-govern. Just as the nudist believes that all you got to do is take your clothes off and stand up, and your own personal history of sexual frustration and sexual unhappiness, plus the thousands of years that have led up to that through generations and upon generations, will also fall away. Everyone will be sexually, in bliss. Right? and we discovered what that was about in the 60s. But in a sense, what Reich is saying is that this is not something that you can impose from the top down. You can't say you're going to self-regulate. Because what you're really trying to say is you're going to be a natural functioning organism whether you like it or not, and whether you're able to or not. So there's often a great deal of misunderstanding and often abuse, both of patients clinically as well as children educationally, because there are profound misunderstandings about what these processes are. The most profound of which is almost all of the response to concepts of self-regulation, or Reich's work, or this kind of work that I've read, with very, very few exceptions, there is, with the exception of Reich, and of Dr. Sobey, who didn't write about it but always talked about it, a profound missing of the inherent natural, basically non-intellectual nature of self-regulatory processes, that they are, as I've said, they are fundamentally elemental processes that function in the organism. They are, in a sense, on a more profound level, which has always interested me and which has always caught my attention, they are what links us not to our humanness, but to our place in nature, our roots in nature. They are in us the same expression of the way, as Reich says, cosmic forces organize, the way elements organize, the way molecules interact. They are basically what is natural about us. These are the forces that are really what we come from and what we go back to, in a sense. And whatever this is that's going on now is in some way a congealing or a moment in between that. And in a sense, for most of us, to accept that and surrender to that is profoundly chilling and very, very scary. Because what it means is that you're basically letting go and saying, whatever it is, I give myself over to the way. And at some point, what it means is, I think underneath it all is a profound, the greatest fear of self-regulation, it seems to me, and this is personal, just in my own observation, is a fear of death. Is that because what's inherent in it is we all know that the big self-regulating moment is coming, when we're all going to, I don't want to depress everybody on Sunday.
Control.
See, something in which you're going to have to say, well, whatever, it doesn't matter if I fight it, doesn't matter if I try to organize it, doesn't matter if I try to figure out when, how, what it's going to be. At some point, we're all going to have to go, okay, and let go, and just go, wherever, whatever, whoever, and it doesn't matter. So.
You look so happy.
What? No, I'm smiling only out of terror. As we all do.
No, but there really is. I've just had two parents pass away in the past couple of years, and I was there, and you can actually see it. I'm not saying it's going to happen with everybody, but they fight it, without articulating. You can just see it. They're fighting, and they're breathing. And there is that moment when they do seem to let go, and the breathing gets very more gentle and.
It's surrender. And that's what's so very scary about it. And to me, I think what Reich was able to do was to say, look, it's just a natural phenomenon. All of this is part of natural process, and if you examine it that way, then there's a continuum. If you constantly try to impose on it, what humans have done, and it's understandable for whatever reason, we're constantly trying to impose on these natural processes order, explanation, how things get that way. Even these lectures, we're all looking for, so that's what it's about, or that's why we do that, or that's how that happens. And the fact is, it simply is. And in a sense, there is, the best you can hope to do, it seems to me, is to notice those processes, examine them both, observationally in nature, and to maybe have a clearer understanding of them. But even that understanding in no way vaccinates you against the inevitability and absolutely fundamental. And I mean, in other words, it doesn't matter what you or I think about these processes. It doesn't matter what name we give to them. It doesn't matter how we decide to organize them. Reich's favorite joke, right? And there's a big argument historically about where this joke came from. But Neill always maintained that it was his joke, right? So when you finally see the letters of Neill and Reich, you find out that Reich told the joke to Neill in a letter, and Neill then used it, sort of lifted it and presented it as his own. Turns out that it's not even really Reich's, wherever he heard it from. As far as I can understand, someone who is a Sufi, involved with Sufism says it's an old Sufi anecdote or teaching parable. But the joke, anyways, is, which is better than all that. The joke is the devil is in his domain, right? And one of his assistants comes running down from up above on earth, and he said, and the devil's relaxing, and the little assistant comes down, "Master, master, there's been a catastrophe." And the devil says, "What's up?" He says, "They discovered the truth on earth." He says, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll just send someone up there to organize it." and that's always, Reich thought that was, you couldn't say it any better. That is our want, our nature as humans is to constantly try to make sense out of processes that are beyond sense. I mean, and so in the most fundamental sense, self-regulation is beyond sense. Okay, now. When we come into the fact what is sensible, what is something that we deal with sensorily, is something like parenting, and by extension, okay, education. And those are two other words that have to then be looked at. Reich was less interested in those issues as specific theoretical issues. Neill was more articulated about that. The first thing to understand, for instance, is that Summerhill, in Neill's terms, was never a school. Right? So if you read his writing about it, Summerhill is described as does anyone know? Experiment in child rearing. Right? He was, I mean, when Neill was interviewed, you say, matter of fact, Neill's views on education were, prehistoric practically. I mean, his idea about how you learn to add and multiply was you memorize, and you do it exactly the way the most conservative schools in England have done it for years. Had no particular interest in the methods of, making more humane methods of education.
Yeah, like you can see, he say, when people ask him, well, Summerhill, do you have any new methods for teaching? And you say, well, no, because I don't really consider teaching all that important.
No, but not only that, he was usually more
provocative.
I mean, he basically thought teaching was one of the great torture systems. In his views, he was trained as a traditional Scots teacher called a dominie, which was basically you ruled by brutality. I mean, they literally taught in the educational training, techniques of whipping and corporal punishment. No, I'm serious, this is not a joke. I mean, we laugh at it only because it sounds outrageous. So this was not a particularly, his views on education were that they were an abomination, but that his views more significantly is that if children were given the opportunity to learn, they were inherently capable of a great range of learning, but that learning could be and had to be essentially linked to rational processes or maximizing rational capabilities of learning in an environment that was inherently conducive to engagement socially and naturally. Those are the kinds of concepts that Neill was concerned with. So the actual processes of how you learn, what you teach, were irrelevant to him on some level. So you can see the kind of potential loggerheads that school, the board of regents or whatever, of an educational system is not going to want to hear that. Oh, reading, they'll learn how to read when they want to learn. And interestingly, with Summerhill, the follow-ups, and there have been numerous follow-ups of students of Summerhill. Students of Summerhill overall are far more successful, you know, in achieving life goals than most students generally are. So that interestingly, although critics have often said, yeah, well, they're usually kids from upper class families, you know, I mean, this is a little bit, it's the old line, which is the same thing with medically, with Reich, you know, with orgonomy. If I treat somebody for asthma, okay, and the person, you know, has been in and out of hospitals for asthma for years, and then they stabilize and they use medication on a much more limited basis, and they don't go into the hospital for years, the response is that it's not the treatment, right? It's just they grew out of it or something happened. And this is over and over and over again. Dr. Sobey treated 6 cases of tuberculosis successfully. The response of all the doctors who had diagnosed these people as terminal, right, was that, well, we were wrong, they probably didn't have tuberculosis. It was a misdiagnosis. So this is a standard situation. And similarly in education, the assumption is that if you run a school based on premises that aren't approved of, and the kids do well anyways, then it must not be the school, it must be, you know, other processes, or, you know, it's teaching music. You know, I mean, obviously, if you develop a technique for teaching music that isn't consistent with other techniques, I mean, Norman has talked about this, you know, and the kid somehow winds up being a good musician, well, obviously it wasn't because of the technique, it was just because the kid was musically gifted anyways, or would have become a good musician, you know, however he or she was taught. So again, the problem with this is that these kinds of approaches are constantly marginalized and pushed off to the side of social acceptance. And I think Neill was much more, you know, accepting of that on some level. He understood that society in no way could easily embrace these ideas, although I think secretly he had hoped that there would be a broader, you know, acceptance. In some ways, some of these ideas do get incorporated, which leads me to the latter part of the theme for this morning, which is what happens when individuals who are looking for answers come to this kind of material and embrace it, often for essentially for reasons that are not really inherent in the knowledge that we're dealing with. But you had a question.
Just a quick one. I only am familiar with Summerhill from the beginning books on it, and at
That's
that
all
time,
there is.
well, at that time, it seemed to me he was getting students who were, the parents had thrown up their hands
Right.
and said, "I can't do
Yeah,
it."
no, that
What
was
is
that
happening now? I mean,
pretty much the same.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. I mean, the problem
So
was
he's very successful.
Yeah,
really.
Neil always complained, as does his daughter now, who runs the school, that you couldn't even really judge Summerhill as a real experiment in self-regulation because, or self-governance, because child rearing, because to really do it right, the real idea was to get children pretty much, you know, in the first or second year with parental engagement and support, and create a living environment, almost a communal. At one point, Neill and Reich were in collaboration, and one of the projects in Oregon on which Neill was considering coming, that Reich had talked to him about coming to run, was to establish a learning and child rearing community at Oregon that would, that would have it. But there probably would have been problems with that too. I don't think realistically it's just that simple. But Neill's big complaint was always that on the whole, most of the students he got, right, were students who had been profoundly damaged. I mean, these were not even just kids who had, the only reason he got these students in most cases was because parents in other schools had basically said, this kid can't, function here, he can't be in school. Even in schools for disturbed kids, these kids were being thrown out. Neill had only one rule. There was only one rule at Summerhill. There was only one kind of child that they would not take, and that was arsonists. And there was only arsonists. And Neill would say, the reasons are obvious. He said, I wish I could, but he said, that we can't do because that's too, and he took in some really bizarre kids. I mean, kids who had been, the famous story of the kid who no school would take him because this kid, every time he was near any glass, he would break it with a stone, And so anecdotally, what Neill did is he took the kid out the first day, got a pile of stones, and he said, well, you know, your parents are paying for it, so go ahead.
You let him break all the dishes and.
Yeah, he let this kid keep throwing stones, and Neill picked up a few stones and threw them also. They broke every window in the house, and before they were finished, the kid said, "This is no fun." And that was, it didn't mean the kids would, Now, those anecdotes would imply that, oh, this is magic, and the kid lived, the kid had a lot more growing and struggling to do. And, the next day, the glazier came in and put the windows back, and the parents got the bill. The point is, what Neill was able to do, and here's the crucial issue, what Neill was able to do, as what I think Reich was able to do, and here's the issue. Neill trusted inherently in this process. So no matter how, and this is a very unique quality, and I don't know that I have it, I don't know how many people have it. Neill was an exceptional human being, and an exceptional person. Neill fundamentally understood and believed this, or knew this, that if he stayed with it and followed it to its course, the child would ultimately reveal their core, their natural functioning, and then you could begin to help them find a way of functioning and operating from that core. And in the process, he was willing to have windows broken, he was willing to have a world that had garbage that was a little bit smelly, or that wasn't necessarily, or kids who walked around without having bathed for a couple of days, and that occasionally some kids would get hurt, or there could be some messiness, and there could be, as Reich often pointed out, the serious side of this is that you commit yourself to this kind of process, since you're trying to reverse thousands upon thousands and thousands of years of these more oppressive systems, as you begin to break through and to reorganize or to try to reestablish that process, there can be many, many innocent victims, people who fall by the wayside. And now that's easy to say in a lecture, but if it's your kid, or if it's your family member, or if it's a friend or a friend's kid, that's tragic, and that's personally very, very hurtful and sad and profoundly tragic in its implications. So this is not something to be looked at casually. What happens at Summerhill is there's this profound commitment. Kids go into this environment and they're going to go the distance. And it's not. And someplace along the line, Neill didn't say, "Well, maybe we're doing the wrong thing. Maybe we should try a little bit of this or a little bit of that." Now, what happened in America, particularly, I think in England also, but what happened in response to these ideas, I think it's very hard for audiences today, or people who are interested in this today, to realize that in the 50s and 60s, when these ideas were initially expressed and acted upon, these were not only radical, which they remain today, but they were embraced on a broad scale. But they were embraced by individuals who did not have the capacity to go the distance in most cases. They did not have a sense of what it really meant to strip away these layers, right, that kept us repressed. I mean, it was okay, and we all understood about getting rid of our oppression, throwing off the bonds that that hold us down, breaking our chains and reestablishing our natural functions. All that kind of stuff was fun to talk about and anticipate. But many, if not most, had no idea what it was going to be like when you started going down through the muck. Most therapists, Dr. Sobey always points this out, right? He says this numerous times, are not at all prepared for what is going to emerge if you start breaking through. It's nice to think about how we have these techniques, they're going to help us break through, and then there's going to be light, and the skies will open, and everyone will dance happily into the twilight. That's not what it is. And anyone who's been through a process of trying to work through their own injuries and their own process of healing understands that it is a painful, often lonely and frightening process, and that can be very, very disruptive, to say the least. So that these things socially are also the case. So it's not simply just saying, okay, now take your baby home you know, and nurse it whenever it wants to be nursed, and everything is going to be okay. These are the dangers of the mystifying and the sentimentalizing of these processes, okay? So what happens to these concepts when they're organized by armed organisms is the key. And a couple of things happen. There are a number of different directions you can move. The most obvious is when these principles tend to become visible, you can respond to them, or these impulses, these natural processes, you can respond to them in what would be the more reactionary way, which is simply to put the brakes on, to set limits, to impose conditions and authoritarian, you know, regulation, as the church, you know, most highly organized states, school systems would. Then there is the impulse that says, no, there's got to be a softer, better, nicer, more natural way. And then so what emerges is what we would call the liberal response to these impulses. Okay? Reich never considered himself a liberal. He never considered himself a reactionary. He never considered himself a conservative. He considered himself a radical. And what he was interested in is the fact that radicalism meant simply that you were offering, insights and positions based on specific fundamental understandings that would interfere with any kind of social organization, social stability, right? That wasn't consistent with those findings. So that, in a sense, he wasn't interested in whether a liberal government fell or a liberal approach, you know, fell, or a conservative approach. He wasn't interested in whether you were a Catholic or a Jew or a Marxist or, you know, communist. What he was interested in is the fundamental functioning of the organism, so that any of those ideologies, those social organizations that were consistent with fostering those capabilities were fine, and any that were not had to be jettisoned, had to be confronted and responded to. So in that sense, he had no agenda other than following. Again, it comes back to one of the first things I ever said when I started these lectures. With Reich, and Reich says that, with Reich, the whole issue is following the energy. So at the end, finally, when he talks about work democracy and ways of organizing or doing this kind of work and treatment and child rearing, it's about following the energy, the natural processes, our roots in nature. So the problem then becomes liberalism and how you define liberalism. Liberalism, to begin with, is a mystification, is always a mystification of radical insights into natural behavior. The liberals' position is always to say, well, gee, that looks good. It's how can I organize it? How can we make it more palatable, more accessible, and easier? Liberals, one of the reasons that when we have reactions against liberalism, it's because liberals are always saying, this is the easy way out. This will be nice. This will be okay. Look at how much easier it is this way. The problem is liberals historically always are afraid of the harder consequences. The liberal is the guy or the person who runs away when the implications of what they've set in motion, turn out to be messier than they had anticipated. So the tendency is for the liberal to see taking the clothes off or being more, allowing more dirty language in movies as an answer to greater educational, greater emotional expression, when in fact it usually leads mostly to greater, less articulation, less examination of real issues. And then what happens invariably, as you see, then liberals who are all in favor of free speech and stuff start getting like, this is disgusting. Why are we letting it, the old lines, you scratch a liberal long enough, you're going to find a reactionary and a conservative underneath that. But really behind it is the mystification. And the problem is that when one mystifies, when one deifies, when one sets goals and dogma above certain as pure truth, the problem is when it doesn't work, what do? You spit on it. You say, see, the God has failed me. So the truth of the path to paradise or a greater existence has failed. Therefore, let's throw out everything, you know. And that's very, very typical of of the liberal. I mean, that's the old Tonto and Lone Ranger joke. You know, what do you mean, meat, weed, white man? You know, everyone knows that joke.
I do.
When Tonto and the Lone Ranger finally are surrounded by a bunch of hostile Native Americans, and the Lone Ranger says, "Well, Tonto, it looks like this is it for us." And he says, "What do you mean us, white man?" So anyway, but in a sense, that is the classic. You couldn't get a better definition of the classic liberal position. Is the liberal is willing to go the distance until the distance gets tiring or gets more frightening. So in a sense, when we look to how this plays out in parenting, it's again, trust the child until the child gives you, more trouble than you want, then come down on the child, blame the child. All these patterns come back in, and the same in education. It's trust the child, but the child, if the child doesn't learn the way he's supposed to or she's supposed to, then obviously something is wrong, and you got to put it in more of the old, requirements. It's trust the child as long as the child performs. So it's performance-based, not trust the child, and the fact that your child is not reading when they're 12 years old doesn't mean that they're not going to read when they're 16 or 17 and they need to learn how to read for some reason. But, and it's hard. How many among us are going to say, okay, well, I don't care if my kid doesn't know how to read when they're 17. They'll learn to read when they need to. They'll get along. I mean, it's hard. So the result is, the test of these positions is always, are you prepared to run the risks of your kid or of you being one of the innocent victims along the line? And I'm not making a case that you should. I'm just saying you have to be aware of that when one engages this. So that in one sense, Reich was always very emphatic. There's the anecdote where he came in and said to a bunch of the doctors, well, what do you think of the Catholic Church? And all the doctors, all the organomists said, oh, the Catholic Church, one of the great evils, in the world. It's done this, it's repressed this, it's against sexuality. And Reich turned around and said, I wouldn't want to live in a world without the Catholic Church, not right now. I said, what do you mean? He said, they keep things functioning, they keep things going. Without the Catholic Church or similar institutions, you wouldn't be able to walk, down the block. People would be out, giving into their most doing their own thing. So that to simply assume that the answer here is, to put these things down, to reject these things, you have to understand that it's step by step. That there probably is something profoundly more radical to radicalizing or to modernizing or to sensitizing Catholic institutions, which has been going on slowly for decades now or longer, than there is the idea of let's get rid of religion, simply by throwing it out. And usually what you see, most of the most active people who at midlife embrace the church or Judaism or find, are individuals who early in life were usually liberal and rejecting of the church and rejecting of these ways, and now facing the cold, hard realities of living in the world, find that the church and these other things offer some sense of solace and security. There are fundamentally what most people who are easily liberally, anti-church, anti-state, often come from is a perception that these institutions have failed, they want solutions, and when those solutions aren't quick coming, there's a sense of insecurity, and what is often missed is that these institutions have come into being as attempts of human beings to find solace and solution and security against the fundamental, vagaries or uncontrollableness of nature. Right? So if there's a storm brewing, you get under a shelter, you don't necessarily realize until you're under there for a while that it's rotted out at the bottom and liable to collapse. Then you realize, well, maybe this wasn't the best shelter, maybe I gotta fix it up a little bit. But basically, you take shelter wherever you can. And most of these institutions that we're confronting with are shelters against, the hardships of living in nature. Nature is not a fair or nice or inherently rational place. It simply is. And so,
Well, to carry that further, they also take refuge against the anxiety of sexual life. And by getting into an institution that disregards that or forbids it, they escape that anxiety also.
But basically, I think the issue is less whether it's escaping sexuality. It's to escape anxiety of all types, and that the common functioning principle under all anxiety is fear of natural sexual functional pulsation. So all institutions, one embraces the tax system, one embraces the transit system, one embraces society as a shelter against natural functioning principles. But again, it's a way of creating security, of not self-regularity, of regularity, of predictability, really, and therefore a reduction, or at least an apparent reduction, of anxiety. Problem with all of that is it's all very well and good until you hit what? Y2K. And everyone's walking around saying, oh, I've invested all this energy and money, but mostly all this energy in the fact that the world is going to be predictable, and that tomorrow I know that everything is going to be working. And all of a sudden, when you confront the fact that maybe it won't, then what is everyone really experiencing? It's not about technology. When I stand in a shop and hear some uneducated, uncomputer educated person, going on about Y2K and what's going to happen, what do I hear usually? What do you hear? Fear, anxiety, that it's not going to, it's raw anxiety. It's not about, technology. It's about the fact that their lives, which they've bought into, they've bought a contract that says, tomorrow it's going to, you're going to turn on your machines and it's going to work, and now you're being told it doesn't. So there's a sense of underlying all of this is that what we do is we buy into these things for security against the feelings of lack of being out of control and not being on top of it. And the same thing with education. We put our kids in school for what reason?
Get them out of the house?
Yeah, probably. Or to get them socialized. What?
This is ridiculous. The kid goes to school to learn to function in the society.
To socialize. To be socialized.
Somebody told me when my son was very young, I made the mistake of having to go to 15th Street School for a year or two. He said, I know the structure that people, they don't know what self-regulation is. He would be better off going to a parochial school and learning to read. And this is when the kid was 6.
Right.
So,
You put children in school. You put children in school to socialize, to establish a secure, predictable, entry into.
We wouldn't be here. I really get head up about this, but we wouldn't be here, any of us, if we hadn't gone through enough of this. And I'm not just talking about the problems of self-regulation or harm or anything like that. The ability to comprehend that, we want them better if we hadn't gone through some learning process.
Again, schools have a very natural function socially. They are processes of conditioning individuals to be socially functional within the limits of social predictability. So that involves all the things that are necessary, like reading, writing, math, whatever it is. But the real lesson in school is how to become a essentially, adult member of whatever society you go
Why
in.
can't the child learn that outside of an organized
I'm not
situation?
sure they can't. It depends, but it also then depends because to some extent you need to have individuals who are invested in the social order that you want your child to learn to be. So it depends on whether you're prepared for your child to potentially be a non-member or a marginal member. So the answer is children can learn in all sorts of environments. I mean, Neill's kids, the kids at Neill School, learn very, very effectively. And they often become effective adult members, but they almost all, I should have added, while they're all very successful, they're usually most successful, and Neill was always proud of this, they're most successful in what would be ordinarily considered marginal areas of social engagement. The arts, you have very few Neill was always proud of the fact that he produced his schools produced very few doctors and lawyers.
When you're talking about being marginal in a society that is profoundly sick, then you're not, that to me is not a negative.
Well, I mean, again,
in that society,
that's right, but you have to be prepared then, and this is the area we enter into where everyone starts rubbing their heads and feeling frustrated, and stuff, because what you're really coming up against is how you view or where you view your position in the society, what your views of society are. All I'm saying is you have to understand what these mechanisms are. That once you begin to organize these natural processes in one direction, you're going to get one result. If you choose to go in another direction, you're going to get another result. Those results are not necessarily, a simple, that you do it this way, that's better, and you do it this way, that's worse. For many individuals, being given in quotes, liberal education, or in quotes, a free self-regulatory child rearing can lead them to positions where that marginalism becomes very, very untenable and very, very painful and very, very destructive. Whereas other individuals do far better in much more structured, ordered position. Most kids who are raised in a more self-regulatory way have a harder time with it, at least initially. What tends to be the pattern that we can see is that later in life, usually at the end of their what would be called adolescence or their young adulthood, they often get much more focused and much more structured and much more capable of responding to their own decisions and they have usually a lot more self-confidence, a lot more ability to ride out the traumas of living in the real world. But often, until you get to that point, it can be quite disruptive, it can be quite unpredictable, it can be quite painful. So usually most systems of education work quite well to basically create less anxiety for parents and to take more responsibility off. The problem with raising your children self-regulatorily is that it then becomes primarily your function as a parent to rear them, and you're not giving it over. So it creates it has to be a different kind of system. So the question is, the worst is to abandon your kids and say, well, I hate school, you don't have to worry about school, but then offer them nothing, else.
I just want to comment. One of the things that I remember vividly that Dr. Sobey said, that apparently that he had for his son Tony in the early years of his schooling, he had a tutor come in and work with Tony and one or two other kids. I don't remember the exact details. And the tutor would teach them things like reading and math in the morning, and in the afternoon would take them out on trips, through the city. And it seemed to be working real well, but at some point, Sobey and his wife got anxious about that. Maybe at this point, he should be in the school. And they did. They stopped the arrangement. I think it was second grade. I can't remember the exact detail. Doesn't matter. I put him in school. And at the point, Dr. Sobey was expressing to me his doubt whether he did the right thing. He says, on one hand, he says he was in school and he was learning well, but he noticed a decided effect on his energetic function. He said his eyes became dull, and he noticed a loss of spontaneity in the boy. And probably until the day he died, he probably didn't know whether he did the right thing.
No, and the problem is you don't know whether you do the right thing. The problem is that's the perfect antidote. Because what happens invariably in these situations is that we as adults get anxious. Okay? So I'll give you anecdotally from my own experience. When I was at Columbia, was involved with research. The people I was doing my doctorate with were doing a lot of big research into homework and what homework is. It was very interesting. All they found out is that nobody knows what homework is. This was a cross-cultural, this was a worldwide project, a huge amount of money behind it. And that they couldn't come up with really a definition of, one, what homework is and what it does.
Repetition of
maybe,
what they
but not really, because when you actually look at homework, right, the homework that you take home is never really a repetition of what you're learning in school. It's always a little bit different when you do it at home. But the main thing was, well, they did come up with interesting things. What's the best way for kids to do homework? As Americans, what would you
in front of a TV? With a parent.
Well, no, you're too educated.
Sitting at the dining table.
Yeah. Basically, the standard American approach to doing homework is what? This is the wrong. You're not a mainstream audience in the group. The standard American approach is go to your room and do your homework. Right? The most effective way that children learn by doing homework is to have an adult sitting with them. They don't have to do it with them. It's just to have them there. Right? Which, interestingly, what it primarily really does, although they weren't looking at it, is it reduces anxiety.
Well, I should sit at the kitchen table.
Yeah, right.
Well, the kid's not there.
We were there.
Right. But the interesting thing is, mostly what homework does is alleviate, guess what? Of who? Of who? Of the parent and the teacher.
It also, this is an anti-rational thing. I'm amazed at it. It isn't. What homework does for a kid is it learns how to, I hate the word, organize its mind, its thoughts, into something coherent so it can go on and learn something more.
You haven't done homework recently. You haven't done homework recently. Most homework does not do that.
I did high level homework.
Yeah, well, okay, but most homework does not encourage organization and
well, that's crap education. It's crap education.
No, it's the nature of homework. The basic reality, there's nothing that homework does, right, that cannot be done in school without doing homework. Yeah. Well, whatever. I mean, the point is, the reality is homework's primary function worldwide is to it does two things. It teaches children how to essentially discipline themselves and to condition themselves for the kinds of tasks and jobs that they will have to probably do. And it basically alleviates parental anxiety that my kid isn't learning enough. What is he doing? What is she doing in school? Okay. The reality is, most children like school, provided they can come and go as they please and study and do what they want to do. So Dr. Schwartz, who worked with us, daughter who's now in college, who was a very bright kid, you say, how do you like school? She'd say, well, there's about 3 hours a day, that's great. And if I could go for those 3 hours a day and she didn't mean recess. I mean, actually, most kids, if you ask them, do they like recess, those are not the activities they want school for. What they mostly want are whether it's math, science, reading, history, whichever, it's the stuff that they really relate to. What happens in school
with a teacher.
And a teacher, right. And it's amazing and the social connections. So a kid, if I look at my own daughter, and that's where a lot of this came out of, I started looking at these processes. When my daughter has good social relations, friends that she really enjoys, her learning just expands incredibly. I mean, she just, just sops stuff up. Oh, I want some of that, I want some of that. Yeah. And even in areas where she's not, that interested, she just opens. When she's, socially contracted or unhappy or having a hard time, interpersonally, learning begins to, suffer. What homework does and what the order does is it sort of tells her that, well, even if you're having a hard time, you've got to perform. It sets a sort of baseline reading of where the society expects you to perform. I'm not saying that that's wrong, and that's what Dr. Sobey was responding to on an interpersonal level. What Neill would say, and what Reich would say, is that if you're really going to try to change this, you have to refuse to accept that kind of baseline standard but you also have to be prepared for the anxiety. So on a personal level, we can say to individuals constantly, right? Don't just hold on. Okay, we can say to individuals constantly, you have these are the most effective way to self-regulate, to have a normal love life, to have a healthy, interpersonal relationship. That if a love relationship, doesn't work, you move on. But that's an easy theoretical line. It's very appealing. It's much harder to deal with the anxiety levels that happen when a established relationship breaks up, especially when there's economics involved, when there's living arrangement involved, when rents in New York are above $3,000, a month. None of which should say that you shouldn't live that way if you, in a more natural way. But often what these kinds of positions lead to are assumptions that because we have some knowledge of what is functional and healthier, that individuals aren't going to have to, go through an incredibly often painful, disruptive experience, and sometimes take, experience real tragedy or disruption in their lives. And as we do clinically, we have to tell people all the time that, look, if you follow certain courses, it's going to mean progress. But progress, the assumption is always with all of this kind of material, both on a personal level as well as a philosophical level, is that these are answers, and then if you lead your life this way, that you're going to feel better, be better, do better, and be happier. And it's all going to be nice. When in fact it often means that all you're going to experience is more stress, often more struggle, hopefully more effectively, but they often will be, and it comes back to basically profound levels of anxiety often are generated by taking action around these issues. Someone like A.S. Neill was exceptionally unique in the fact that he was able to ride through these things with you read to the last letters of his life, and that's right, sublimely confident and optimistic and confident not only in the rightness of what he understood, but in his ability to be there as it played out and through the tragedies, not just the cute little anecdotes, but through the tragedies. And Reich, until the end too, seemed to have that capability. Certainly descriptions of Reich working as a clinician with patients, he could deal with things that most therapists today, and he would say that himself. I mean, if you read Reich's accounts of dealing in treatment of schizophrenia, right, what often isn't said, if you read character analysis in the treatment of a schizophrenic that he describes, which is brilliant, is what he said at the seminar after he presented this material, which is he told all the doctors, you guys can't do this, and you shouldn't do it because you don't have the structures to go the distance with this. It's too scary, it's too painful. You're not prepared to deal with what happens when you break through a schizophrenic's structure and you have a real breakthrough and you have to take them through to completion. And so the result was, this is important to understand and look at, but you have to realistically understand what you're dealing with here and know your own limitations. I think what Sobey was often telling you, suggesting when he would say things like a more structured environment, was that you have to understand you can't be philosophical about these things, that it's not that you can do good, you can make progress without being guilty that you're not able to be the fully self-regulating parent, and in fact most of us are not going to be, okay, well, now you
I don't mean to say, but look, Dr. Reich many times also said that the Reich, in the context of education as much as personal life, you do it a little bit at a time because otherwise you'll destroy the function. And so he also said, and I've heard him say this, you got to, if you don't like something and you want to get rid of it, you got to have a better idea to replace it.
Absolutely.
And those two things are critical to what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's nonsense.
The problem with, and this was the final sort of fundamental issue that I wanted to address. The problem, there are two areas. One is liberal education, as with liberal parenting. The problem is that it is really often attitudes that are taken strongly from these issues of self-regulation or of freedom or of greater democratic kind of child rearing, you know, or what we call respect for the child, you know, child-centered education, child-centered parenting. These concepts get incorporated and placed over. They don't come up from deep sense of confidence and ability of individuals to handle their own anxieties and work through their own anxieties, okay? But get placed on, right, these insecurities, these anxieties. And so what you get are classically, right, parents who, because of their anxieties, basically deform these basic principles. So that parents who want to give their child freedom to make choices then allow their child to make choices irregardless of how they affect everybody else, so that the child has freedom, right? And so that means that everybody's sitting around having a nice conversation and talking, and the child decides to turn on the stereo in that room so that no one can talk. And the real rational response to that is what? Turn it off and stop. Go to the other room, whatever. But what happens is, in the liberal response, what's the liberal response?
To doubt their own sense of...
Well, the child is expressing themselves, they have a right, it's also their environment, you can't interfere with the child's. You know, in fact, what's really underneath it is what's going to happen if you discipline the child.
Freak out.
They're going to freak out, and then what's going to happen for you? You're going to get anxious because you're going to have to deal with the embarrassment of everybody seeing this and your own insecurity. Maybe I'm interfering with their natural functions and on and on and on. So at the moment, it seems rational or easier or certainly simpler to give in, and then everything is calm, so we all have to listen to whatever, you know, whatever. It doesn't. It could be, you know, a song that you even like played a gazillion times too loud, 100 times, you know, every hour, whatever it is. But we step back from it, and there's an immediate sense of, okay, well, things are quelled. But in fact, what hasn't happened because of the anxiety factor and because of a misreading of self-regulatory processes, I mean, you know, it's like saying, well, a hurricane is coming in, so what I should do is go stand out, you know, in nature and let it hit me. There's no point in hiding, no point in running, because the natural thing to do is to let it do what it's going to do to me. You know, I mean, so the reality is, again, most of us are not stupid enough, unless we were, you know, we came of age in the '60s to do stuff like that, you know, and did a lot of acid. You know, you could maybe think that that was the thing to do. Okay, I'm you know, always keep in mind these people I knew. I wouldn't exactly call them friends, but they were people I knew who sold their house and moved into a teepee. They built a teepee on the back part of the land to really be in part of it, and they made it through the first month of December. You know, before they decided that maybe that wasn't the solution, the route to greater happiness. But again, so that there are these underlying issues of anxiety and fear, but also what comes in is that underneath that is a desire to, in some way, help the child have a more natural experience. But the problem is continuously that most of us are so damaged by the time we become parents ourselves that to understand what is rationally and functionally most effective for a child really experiencing life fully, and by that I mean not only the nice things of life, but just the normal processes of life. Decisions, for instance, even in a school, between a child being in school and having to learn to deal with a teacher who they don't like or isn't the greatest teacher in the world, or isn't, and when to step in, and because there's a real threat to the child's health and security, because the teacher is really irrational or sadistic or doing something that's really negative. Those kinds of lines are very often hard for many of us to negotiate, simply because of our own insecurities about our own ways of making decisions or understanding the world. But in fact, where you really have to look for the problems here, and not so much in the formal positions on education. You know, you see, you go to a school. I went to my daughter's school. It's a child-centered school, right? And that's very appealing to someone who has particular liberal views of how children should be educated. Until you begin to find out that how they deal with problems when it doesn't work, you know, exactly the way that it's supposed to work according to the textbooks or to the teacher ed programs, is essentially to go back to patterns of imposed, learning imposed structures, so that there's a conflict. That conflict, I would propose, is far more destructive, and that's what Dr. Sobey is saying. That kind of liberal conflict or dishonesty or lying is far more destructive than simply saying, look, here's how we do it here. And if you don't like it, you still got to learn how to do it, and this is the way things are. That's why he's saying you do better in a parochial school. In one sense, it's the old line of when I was a kid growing up in the civil rights movement, black friends would often say they'd rather go down south and deal with, you know, Jim Crow, you know, racists in the South than deal with them in the streets, you know, in New York, because there you knew who.
It was honest.
You know who it was. I didn't necessarily like them, but you understood who they were. Here it was like you didn't know whether the guy standing next to you who was saying he was your buddy was really going to sell you down the river. So I mean, there were these kinds of different, and that's the classic issue. So what happens in the liberal education system is these espousing of these kinds of values, but that when insecurities or when problems present themselves, they still go back to, but with an additional element. Unlike the nun, who stands up and says, you'll do it this way or it won't, you know, you'll pay the price, the liberal stands up and says, no, you should do it this way, but if you don't, we'll get you.
They pay a price either way.
Right. Well, probably. But certainly what they do.
It's neither of that. It's not. It is in schools. There's an immense amount in schools. It's neither of those. I mean, that's
Where did you go to school?
more human.
Well, less than you would think. I mean, in fact, what happens more and more now is a great deal of confusion. Because what's happened is that most educational systems are in chaos. And what's happening in most of the liberal education systems is when faced with this kind of chaos, which I don't think is necessarily that bad, okay, in the long run, but when faced with these kind of liberal, with this kind of chaos, most of the more liberal systems basically get scared. And it's the issue of the parent. You know, so we're saying that, well, we weren't sure that we were going the right way, so we sent them to school, and then maybe I made a mistake. What the liberal systems do, and I see this constantly, which is the origin of my concerns and interest about this, is when in doubt they say, well, maybe we really do have to impose the other kind of. So in my daughter's school, for instance, perfect case in point, this is one of the most liberal schools in New York City, right? Real built on this whole principle. They don't use Reich and Neill, but they use
Dewey.
well, not Dewey, Dewey and the open school model and this and that, the whole Bank Street model, child-centered model. So and this has been going on, throughout the country, particularly in more liberal, progressive school systems. About 5 years ago, there was never any homework in the school. You never gave homework. That was a standard thing. About 5 years ago, parents started getting anxious about how much. Meanwhile, these kids were kids who came to the school always did well. But about 5 years ago, parents started becoming anxious. How do we know what our kids learn? They don't do any homework. They don't give exams in the school either. They didn't. So how do we know about what our kid is learning? You don't give exams. We have no way of judging. How do we know whether our kid is learning as much as the kid in PS whatever, or this one over here, or that one over here? The kid over here is learning X, Y, and Z. My kid hasn't read this book yet, and on and on and on. So the response of the school, instead of standing up and saying, well, this is the way we do it, and you either stay with us or you don't, the schools have gone complete, and this is not just this school, it's all over. More homework, more standardized testing, because it's again a response to the anxiety levels that are raising and concern. And there's no data to show that the kids who went to the school when they didn't give homework did any Matter of fact, by relative standards, they all did incredibly well. They all went to the best high schools, the best colleges, and you could always say that it's because they came from the right families. It didn't matter. but the point is, these are responses that because these are not rooted in a fundamental knowledge of these kinds of experiences. And this is not to blame the people who are involved in this, parents or teachers. Okay? So that if we look at it from a more basic, fundamental parental thing, where you see these things begin to impact on the developing youngster in the society is how parents deal with issues of, say, breastfeeding. So, you know, in the liberal view, breastfeeding is very good. Right? It's very natural, it's what you should be doing. In the reality that if you have a parent, a woman, who doesn't feel comfortable breastfeeding and is guilty and breastfeeds because she has liberal or she's pressured by liberal views, right? You're going to be doing as much damage to that child as if you were, you know, not breastfeeding that child. Right? And on the other hand, you're going to get a clear insight into how individuals turn around and say, well, I don't understand why Johnny has all these problems. I breastfed him for 3 years, but nobody looks at how the breastfeeding took place. So that breastfeeding, for instance, is often presented in the liberal literature as a panacea, as a vaccination against all those kind of problems, when in fact it is not simply breastfeeding. It is the way breastfeeding proceeds in terms of a whole organization of physical, emotional, and energetic interactions. Go. People have to leave their own sense. Similarly, the issue is something like circumcision. Right? What you're seeing is that if one looks at all these kinds of classic issues, we can say circumcision is very, very good to fight against circumcision. You won't get any arguments from me on that. It's absolutely true. On the other hand, in the hands of individuals who are armored in some profound way, you get the anti-circumcision movement in this country. Much of it is really bizarre, brutal, anti-life, anti-sexual. It seems.
What are you referring to?
There's a group called No Circ. It's a national anti-circumcision group. What?
What's the matter with it?
Among other things,
Yeah.
well, there's a segment of No Circ that believes essentially that circumcision is a Jewish conspiracy. Right? That it attracts a wide range of very, very flaky, conservative, anti, natural.
But if it results in fewer young boys being circumcised, that's good.
Not necessarily. That I would argue that a child being circumcised is not necessarily as bad as the circumstances around the circumcision in terms of the social and political views. Now, I'm totally anti-circumcision.
I understand that.
What I'm saying is that any position, no matter how right it is, if it gets organized in an essentially anti-life way, winds up bringing with it negative. It's not the act of circumcision, which is terrible under any circumstances, but a decent, loving mother and father who, for ignorance, circumcise their child are going to do far less harm than a group of fanatics who decide that we're not going to circumcise their child and raise it in this way. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not talking about the specific physical act. Just as I'm saying, the act of breastfeeding is by nature an incredibly nurturing, positive act. But if it's carried out, by individuals who are out of touch with the naturalness of it, it becomes really a vehicle for often conflict and confusion and even contraction in the organism. There is nothing more horrendous than watching a woman who doesn't really want to breastfeed or feels very resentful about breastfeeding, nursing a baby who is fretful, anxious, unhappy, even though the breast is in the mouth. And so what I'm saying overall is that these are highly complex processes that can't simply be regulated by saying breastfeeding is good, breastfeed. Circumcision is bad, never circumcise. Okay? You have to look at the full ramifications. That these are functions. Same thing with the family bed. Right? It is essentially a natural process for human beings to sleep together. It's the right way to sleep. It's the natural way to sleep. It's the most efficient way to sleep. But if you have a bunch of individuals, mothers and fathers, who are abusive, insensitive, or highly anxious about being in physical contact with the newborn, it is a hell for that child, for that newborn relatively free organism. So you have to really approach all of this with an eminent sense of the reality, right, of whether the organism is capable of maintaining natural functions. And there again has to do with how, the same thing with childhood sexuality, perfect example. Most of us, I assume in this room, we agree that childhood sexuality is not only natural, it should be encouraged, but if you're uncomfortable, or if you have, particular sexual, problems yourself, or discomfort yourself, and let's say it goes to the extreme, it's very important that children have a sex life. So every day you're asking, are you playing with Johnny? Why don't you go into the room and play with Johnny? It's good to play with Johnny. Why don't you take your clothes off? I mean, you're laughing. You don't think there are parents who have come out of origami or other kinds of attitudes who really push their kids? What do you mean you don't have a boyfriend? You're not trying hard enough. You gotta have a boyfriend. It's not healthy if you don't have a boyfriend. It becomes pathological, even though the truth is, yes, it's good for you to have a natural sex life, it's good for you to do it, but it can become as pathological as saying, don't touch it, don't do it. It's again, what the key is who is presenting, where is this, that if it's simply rhetoric, if it's simply dogma, out of touch with your own natural functions, it's going to become problematic. Right? So, talk about the individual who woman who's breastfed her child, but then when you ask her, well, why did you stop? She said, well, the child was never happy breastfeeding. And then you have to, when you look at the child, or the fact that she was not able to be comfortable with it and it's produced problems. And do you say to her, well, you were wrong, you should have kept breastfeeding? And you say, that's fine, you did the best you could, and that's good, a little bit is better than not. Okay, so these are the fundamental issues, it seems to me, and in one sense, I realize now that I don't know what unconscious motivation I have in terms of coming to the end of this series, or as it's been structured, that I put this in, but I think really as I'm talking here this morning, I guess I'm feeling that the biggest problem really is that it's not that Reich's insights were wrong, which is certainly among many of my ilk and people who have been involved in this work. It's easy to say, oh, Reich missed this, or Reich, and many of them are doing that now. What I'm coming to understand is that, and I realize now, where's Dr. Sobey now that we need him, sort of, how fundamentally simply right he was in saying that it is really not the failure of Reich's knowledge base or what he, was able to, see or understand. It's the fact that most of us are not, structurally capable, and also the world is not necessarily, doesn't make it easy to maintain and stay in touch with these kinds of basic, simple insights. And so that if I had to finally sum up, the issue would be to try to use this kind of knowledge to do the least harm, right, based on this, and to keep in touch with the fundamental insights here, and to look for ways to incorporate and maximize these conditions. So I guess if you're talking about how do you choose a school, you choose a school that doesn't lie about what, that does as much as it can given the limits of what the people running the institution are. So that maybe one doesn't choose a parochial school, but maybe one says the most liberal school isn't necessarily the best answer any more than the most conservative school is the flip side of that. That someplace basically, with people who say, look, within the given limits of the way the world really is, this is what we feel works best. And in a certain kind of practical nature, and I think that comes back to Reich's idea, what Sobey said about going step by step, doing the best you can.
Reich also never gave any specifics.
Right.
When I had my first child, I searched in vain.
Right, that's right.
All of Reich's writing
That's right.
was something.
That's right.
Cool.
That's
What do
right.
I do?
That's
He
right.
says nothing.
That's right, and
So
I can
it's
tell
not
you,
his fault.
I can tell you from being in seminars with people trying to work with this material on a clinical level, the frustration of people saying, well, Reich doesn't tell you how to do it.
Doesn't.
Now, what happens is, for instance, Ellsworth Baker, who was one of Reich's, associates, you pick up Ellsworth Baker's book. I mean, anecdotally, there's a wonderful interaction I had with Dr. Sobey. I started, for one reason, reading Baker's book, and I came to him and said, well, Baker says that when you have this problem, you do this and this and this, and it works. And I tried it on a patient, and it worked. Sobey smiled. I was angry at Sobey. I said, you didn't tell me to do it that way. He said, well, keep doing it, keep doing it. He didn't tell me what to do. He said, keep doing it. That's fine. And then 3 weeks later, I tried the same thing, and it not only didn't work, it led me into a mess. And I came back to Sobey and said, what happened? He said, that's because you went, by the book. He said you weren't in touch. You went this, and this, and then when it worked, fine. That's the problem. Whereas Reich said, look, these are the fundamental principles. These are what we can observe. That really, the best anecdote of this was Sobey's account of going to Reich. Reich had started these series of seminars. Many of you have told this anecdote too, but it's worth hearing again. Reich had started a series of seminars that we actually have on tape. And they're brilliant. There's no question about it. They're just wonderful. And Dr. Sobey always laugh and say, yeah, he remembered the last of those seminars because the day after that he went in for a session with Dr. Reich. And, they were working, and Dr. Reich said to him, so Dr. Sobey, how did you like the seminars? How do you like the seminars? He says, oh, they're fantastic. I can't tell you how many times I'm with a patient, and this problem comes up, and I say, this is how Dr. Reich would do it. And then I said, there are no more seminars. What are you talking about? What's wrong? He said, you're the 5th doctor that I've seen today that's come in and told me that they're all becoming little Reichs. They're all doing it like Dr. Reich. And he said, that's exactly wrong. And he said, therefore, we can't have seminars because we're not healthy enough, none of us, myself included, to put this information out there and for you to discover how to do it yourself. All you're going to do is what you think I do, and you're going to get trapped and make mistakes, and you're going to hurt somebody. It wasn't even about, he wasn't concerned about Dr. Sobey or the other doctors. He said, what I'm doing is teaching you, you're going to start doing stuff, and if I allow this to go on, you're going to hurt somebody. You're going to do something wrong because you weren't in touch. And you thought, and then you'll be mad at me. You'll be mad at Dr. Reich because you'll come back and say, well, I did it exactly the way you said to do it, or the way you did it, and it didn't work. And that's what it is it's, because it's not mechanical. You're building a building, if you have an architect here, you're building a building, you learn how to do it, and you learn that there's certain ways you do it, and that's predictable, and you need to know that. But just as when you learn to deal with human beings, you learn physiology, but in terms of clinical practice or education or child rearing, you got to become basically able to think think in the moment and be in the moment and be innovative.
Isn't it about contact, though? I mean, even in the current
Absolutely.
school system,
Absolutely.
you could have a teacher who has good contact with the students, even in a poor school system, and right there that can make a difference.
That's the best statement you can make. It's absolutely right. It's about contact because you can have a nun, and this is a direct quote from Reich. Reich said, don't forget, so that was one of the last things Sobey said. He said, don't forget that Reich said, there's such a thing as a good Catholic and a good communist and even a good Nazi. He said, it doesn't mean that because someone is caught up in those systems and damaged in some way, that their instincts, and in fact now we see in the literature around the Holocaust, right, that, whether it's Schindler's List kind of phenomenon, but there's a whole phenomenon of the fact that there were people who managed to remain essentially human even in the worst of those circumstances, not to say that they weren't guilty of, potential but remain fundamentally naturally human. Why? Not because of anything other than the fact that somehow their natural functions, their natural functions remain available and intact and in contact. I think what Sanjay is saying is absolutely fundamentally right. It's about contact. So you can get a nun in a repressive parochial school who's quite lively, and who's quite alive, and is quite able to, bring children, in contact with a lot. Even their own sexuality. There were many nuns who were much more sexual than people who called themselves liberal, educator.
Well, you know what they say about those nuns anyway.
Yeah. I'll tell you another story. There was another Dr. Sobey story about nuns, which we won't go on tape.
Is that about starting to get into the habit?
Yeah, right. Mark.
That was a Sobey.
I understand a lot of what you're saying. The question I have, I guess, deals with the fact that if we really wanted to be contactful, we really wanted to be in touch with our own self, being, armored in some way. How do we know? Like, we don't know all the time if we're doing the right thing.
That's right.
But if we understand that there's some anxiety there, so at least you're in touch with the anxiety, can we go through, or should we just, give it to somebody else? Not the anxiety. Not the anxiety. In other words, you're trying to do with something, or deal with something, and you have anxiety about it. And you have anxiety about it, and you have different choices you can do. Whether you breastfeed the child or you don't breastfeed the child. Well, how do you decide if you know you have anxiety? If it's really going to, if you deal with it yourself. What I'm asking probably is, if we know it's us a lot of times, we don't have to. Is there a way we can deal with it ourselves to relieve that anxiety, or to not pass that anxiety on to the child?
Well, you're going to pass it on. There's no way you're not going to. But there's treatment. There's
If
counseling.
you're aware of it to that extent,
That's
it seems to
great.
me you're not in such bad shape.
Yeah, it's
But
a very.
if you are, you still have to deal
Then
with
you
the
get
child.
help.
That's
Then
the
you get
problem.
help. Then you get help. Okay. But it's a question of what help is available, and that becomes problematic. So this young woman who was quite disturbed 7 years ago, who was breastfeeding and began to feel, stimulated and sexually excited, calls the hotline, and basically has her child taken away from her because they think she's a weirdo, and she was disturbed. But she was feeling sexual sensations while the baby was nursing. Her mistake was not in reaching out for help. It was unfortunate she reached out to help to some, really disturbed person on the other end of the hotline who figured that a child, was in danger, and at some abstract level, they were probably right, except it wasn't, So 2 years later, she got her baby back, but but these are the but that's what he said.
Said to his doctors that none of you can really think for yourselves and do, and they're trained to do this.
No. He was saying that by continuing the seminar,
right.
I would only be encourage that. So what he was saying, think for yourself.
Right.
That he was basically saying you have to find, but he was also willing to give them the kind of support. He didn't say you can't come to me and ask for my help. I'm just not going to give you a step. But I was responding with the idea that Reich was very, very meticulously in avoiding the idea of giving you. He would give you the basic insights and the basic way to understand things. Yeah, but he wasn't particularly interested in saying that you work this way, you work that way, you do this.
There is no way.
Because there is no specific
There's
way.
no way in life either.
That's right. You can teach. Norman's a music teacher. Norman can teach someone how to play the piano. You can't teach them how to be, musically, passionate or musically, alive or to write wonderful, beautiful music. But there are ways that you can facilitate that if the individual is inclined or capable of moving in that direction. And that's certainly what Reich was, someone who presented, made available insight. But what Reich would say, and he says it, he didn't do this for you or me, particularly. He did this simply because he was interested in following these things out. So the object wasn't, that I'm going to make the world better or teach people how to do it, step by step. His interest was simply covering these finding solutions to these problems. In the process, he made available certain insights, certain knowledge that can be, if it's approached realistically and not mystically and not, romantically, valuable and useful to some extent. And for the rest of it is our struggle.
Also, probably by deliberately avoiding giving any kinds of advice, he was probably also saying very strongly that your own structure, you can only do what your structure will let you do anyway.
That's right.
Well, that's my question.
So you work on your structure.
Own structure.
So you work on your structure. So you're going to have to work on your own structure, which is what therapy can help with. Although there's no magic bullet, but it can help you to be more directly connected to your own structure. Okay, that's all, folks. Oh, yeah. Anybody owing me money, pay up. You need to call me.